I'm not the person you came to see today, but I will bring everybody out. How great was it to hear that music again? And everyone was just excited backstage to hear it too, sincerely. So I'd love to bring everybody out, starting out with the creators, Marshall Herskovitz and Ed Zwick. Polly Draper. Timothy Busfield. David Clennon. Melanie Mayron. And Peter Horton.
Alive.
He's alive. Peter joked to me earlier when I was coming out here and asked if I drew the short straw to have to do this panel, and I told him very correctly that everyone was fighting to do this panel in my office. And there are a lot of people in the audience who confess to me that they're supposed to be somewhere else right now. There are executives who have TV shows on other panels happening right now, and they are here instead. So there's so much love for 30-something. And the great thing about the audience at ATX is that everyone loves to get granular and hear the sort of how Bill becomes a law type stuff. So I'd love to just start off with, where did this come from? Where's the germ of the idea for the show?
Okay. Ed and I had a deal at MGM Television, but we wanted to make movies, so we didn't want to make a television series, but we were supposed to try to come up with one. So we had a network meeting coming up, and we had thought of all these bad ideas, and we looked at each other and we said, you know, what if we sold one of these bad ideas? We'd have to make it. That would be awful. So I actually set about a goal. I said, what we need is a show that we'd like to do that has no chance of ever going. And we sat down, and out of that came this idea of, well, why don't we just talk about people we know, since no one's going to be interested in people we know. And that was the genesis, essentially. I mean, you can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I had just made my first movie and thought that that was going to be my life, and that was certainly our intention together. But of course, what happens to a writer, and as you create something, you create the beast, and then you fall in love with the beast, and then you want to serve the beast, and we walked into this room full of executives who, just coincidentally, had the same issues, the same context that we did about our lives, and we did not pitch it in any conventional way so as to say it was this great story. In fact, we just talked about what was happening in our lives, and that was mirrored in what was happening in their lives. And before we knew it, we wrote this draft. They looked at it. They didn't ask us to rewrite it. They said, shoot it. We went and found these extraordinary people, and all of a sudden, we were in the center of a whirlwind.
So there was no sort of question of, but we've never seen anything like this. What's your comp? Like, what is this, if we're trying to sell this to the network?
Well, one thing you have to understand is at the moment, you know, there were only cops and lawyers and doctors. There were only franchise shows. And the network was in the toilet. They just didn't know what else to do. They thought, oh, we might as well try this.
That's kind of a great spot to be in, right? So it's sort of like, do what you will, because we haven't figured it out ourselves.
We've always thrived in that position, actually. We've done other things at networks who at that moment were in the toilet. But we wrestled with this, by the way. The two of us wrestled with, how do you do a series where there's no hook, you know? And in fact, we credit Ed's wife, as a matter of fact, because we were sitting in our office, you know, desperately trying to imagine, like, well, then what are the stories are about, you know, and we couldn't quite get it. So in those days, you know, if you spent 3 hours in the office, that was a long day. And, you know, we went home to his house, and we told his wife, Liberty, this weird idea we had, and she went, oh, that's so great. You know, we have this friend whose name actually was Gary, and we have this other friend doing this and that. And she said, you know, this person's afraid to have kids. You know, she kind of filled it in, and it was her enthusiasm, I think, that made us imagine that somehow you could do this thing when there was no sort of groundwork that was recognizable for television of how you make that into a series.
I'd love to hear from the actors sort of how you were pitched it, either from an agent or from these guys, just sort of how is it explained to you at the first blush of it?
I thought it was a movie. I didn't know it was a TV show. I just get something for an audition, and I would go in for it, and I thought this was a movie, and because it was written not like a TV show. It was so well written. It was so intricate and so different from anything I'd seen that wasn't a movie. So I just went in on the premise that I was going to do a movie. So it was all under false pretenses.
I'd moved to Sacramento at the end of a show called Trapper John MD, and I started, thank you, one of those doctor cop shows that they were talking about. And I had Revenge of the Nerds 2, we knew we were going to make, and I was focused on my theater, and I'd said to my agent, I'm not really interested in doing TV. And then she said, there's a script coming, I think you'll like it, it's a TV show. And I said, oh, I better. And I read it, and I was like, this is the best thing I've ever read. And I said, I need to grow a beard to be cast. And I looked young, I was 29, and I looked about 25. And without the beard, and so I started growing a beard and kept trying to push the audition, and said, I really want to do it, and went down and read for the guys and loved them immediately, and felt like I was in good feature film company, which I really liked, having been on a TV show that felt very much like a TV show. So
Also, that thing about TV back in when we did 30-something, it wasn't. Now it's just such an art form. Now TV is a whole different thing than it was during our time. It was there was such a divide between TV and movies, and we didn't feel like, oh God, is it good to do a TV show? And then this kind of bridged the gap, and I think changed the whole course of TV history that way. not to brag.
You're completely right.
There was a movie called The Big Chill that was out, I think, a year before. I remember getting the pilot script in New York, and I just thought, oh, wow, this is kind of like that movie. Just because there was never movies just about friends and group of friends and people. But it certainly didn't read like a TV show. I agree with Polly. It was way above that.
I find that my greatest successes were things that I initially turned down. But you'd think I'd learn. On this one, I had started directing before 30-something, and I had known Ed and Marshall from the neighborhood beforehand, and they called me up and they said, "Are you interested? You know, we have this pilot we're doing. Do you want to act in it?" And I said, "Well, I'm not acting anymore." So no. And they said, well, just read it, see what you think. And I read it, and I said, best script ever written for a pilot I've ever read, but no, I'm not acting. And they said, well, why don't you just come down and read with the other cast members? And I did, and then I remember, Ed, you took me aside and you said, first of all, there's no way in the world this is going to go.
Yeah.
And great pitch.
And if for some reason it goes, you can direct one of the first 6. And if for some reason it goes, we'll kill you off after 4 years.
Oh.
And so I said, okay. And as I watched it skyrocket, I was like, oh, thank God they didn't take no for an answer. It would have been hell.
It's sort of hard to remember now that 30-something as a term originated from the show. It didn't exist before the show existed. And it sort of speaks to the huge impact the show had. But at what point did you realize that 30-something was a thing? Not the term, the show.
Well, there's a great story that you tell about that, actually, yeah.
Okay, the night of the premiere, because you have to understand, when you're making television, you start shooting in July, you're in a vacuum. No one knows about your show, you're just doing this thing. And then the premiere comes in September, and you find out your fate. So here we were in our vacuum. It premieres on ABC on Tuesday night at 10 o'clock. And in Los Angeles, at the end of the show, it cuts right to the news at 11 with the local news anchor, who was Tawny Little, who had been Miss America and sort of a local celebrity doing, anchoring the news. And her mascara is literally all the way down her cheeks, and she's still sobbing. And she says, "Oh my God, was everybody watching that show? That show's unbelievable." And I'm sitting there staring at the television.
No, Marshall called me at that moment and said,
That was the moment. Yeah.
That'll do it. How about for the actors? Do you remember when you thought, "Oh, I've got a pretty steady line of work here for a while with this thing"?
We did. Everything was balanced by Ken Olin's cynicism.
By the way, we should say, it's not really the same dynamic without Ken here.
Yeah.
I mean, and Patty as well, but
Mel.
Ken is about the funniest person, that we know. And so whatever we would say, he would find a way to totally take the piss out of it.
I think the fact that he's not here.
Disaster is never gonna go. That would be greeting him at the beginning of the day. I don't know what we're doing. People hate the show. Nobody's ever gonna look at it.
Yeah,
You start to go, well, okay, maybe that'll happen. There was a moment I had in a supermarket where I realized we were affecting people emotionally. It was after an episode called Therapy, where my character tries to avoid having sex with his wife because we've already shot the separation episode. And I was reaching for cream cheese, and I turned, and this woman hit me really hard right in the center of the face. I looked at her and she says, I didn't mean to hit you. And then she dumps. She says, "How could you say to your wife, don't you ever shave your legs anymore? How could you say that?" And I was like, wow, it's just a TV show. But it was along those lines. And then later, Marshall and I were in New York at the Russian Tea Room trying not to get kicked out for wearing tennis shoes. And then afterwards, Marshall said, "I got to show you something." And we walked down the block, and there was a billboard. And what was it? I can't remember. But
It's a BMW ad. Yeah.
And it said 30, but it mimicked 30-something.
Yeah.
When the words started creeping into the vernacular is when I realized, and when Mad Magazine did us, I think that.
That was it, actually. Mad Magazine, that's when we knew. When they, because that for us was like the gold standard.
Yeah.
There was
30 Suffering.
There was also a show called In Living Color at the time, and they kicked around the idea of doing a sketch called 30-something to Life about about two prisoners talking about their feelings.
Well, and someone brought into the office a porn tape called Dirty Something.
I hope you still have
He
that.
was Michael Studman.
I auditioned for that.
Well, when I was cast in the pilot, and I told people I got a show because I was living in New York and I had to move to LA, and they said, "Oh, what's the name of it?" And I said, 30-something. And they said, 30 what? And I said, something. And they said, "You don't know the name of the
Yeah, me too.
You don't know the name of the show you got?" I went, "Yeah, it's 30-something." And they go, 30 what? And I
Who's
went,
on
"Oh my
first?"
God, something." Like it was who's on first, because nobody had heard that term.
But then I guess at some point, then the network starts noticing the show that you're doing, right? Was there a moment where they were like, "Oh, this is real"? Was there a moment when you started getting notes that you weren't getting at the beginning?
Well, this is actually really interesting because it describes a moment in television which is no longer true, but now was no longer true for a long time, but has suddenly become true again, and that has to do with cable. But we, at a very early moment, just committed to each other that we were going to do just what we wanted to do. And the memory that I have vividly is the second episode, and Marshall was down on the stage directing, and I received a phone call from the network, and they had just received our scripts that we had written, the first few scripts, and there was a big group on the call, and they always address it as we. We feel that these episodes that you're writing, might seem a little bit dark, and what do you think about that? And I said, yeah. They said, well, do you think you could maybe just lighten them in some way and find the love and and I took a moment and I said, no. and they said, well, we really think that it's important that this happens, in the show. And then, as Marshall described, it's very important. There's this hiatus because you're shooting the shows and they're not on the air yet. So they're in terrible pucker, sphincter factor fear about what's going to happen. The key is to try to hold out long enough until you go on the air. And if you fail, well, then fuck it, it's over anyway. But we were fighting this sort of battle of attrition. And the idea was, they said, well, couldn't you change this? And I said, well, maybe you should find someone else who could do it better. And it was our commitment at that moment to be that. And the reason I'm talking about historically is that after the Fin-Sin decree and the networks began to own their shows, they took on the license to tell you what to do because it was theirs.
And they would have just fired us.
Yeah, and they would have fired us summarily. They couldn't at that moment. And the interesting thing now is, because of all these platforms and places like Netflix and Amazon, who are again beginning to leave artists alone, that's one of the major reasons why you see this extraordinary, blossoming of originality and distinct content, because it's not being homogenized by others who presume to know better.
The other thing that was after was our first press conference,
Right.
where the press had all looked at our pilot, and we all sat on a stage similar to this, and basically got skewered by everybody in the audience. And one woman even spoke up and she said, "Who are we supposed to love on this show? They're all so whiny." And then she said, "Where's my Fred McMurray character?" And
Nothing but a primetime soap.
Yeah.
I remember them saying that, Murder, She Wrote was the #1 show.
Right.
And people made their living, the television critics made their living off of reviewing television, and they were very smug about our inability to succeed. They felt that it was certain. And it just forced us into being more of a band, a tighter band and family.
One reviewer wrote, said we were skinny white people from hell.
We were skinny at least, right? But the awards started coming right away, right? Eventually, by the end of the season.
Well, as I said, once it went on the air, you have to remember, this is a world in which there are only 3 networks and a 4th one just begun at that moment. So the fact that we were considered very marginally a hit or even a success at about 25 million people watching it. Now something succeeds if they manage to make 1 million people. So it was already, once we saw that it was going to live, that to us was the success. We were going to be able to continue, and we had taken the high moral ground and said we weren't going to take notes, we were just going to do. The awards as they came, that was just unbelievably, beyond anybody's imagining.
With the awards too, also in addition to that, you started seeing who was advertising on the show. Yeah. And when you started to see Johnson & Johnson and Cadillac, the big people that spent, BMW, the big people that were spending the most on advertising, you realize we were a moneymaker for the network.
We found out this was the very beginning of the whole idea of demographic targeting for advertisers. It was literally just beginning in the late 80s. And after we'd been on the air for a couple of years, somebody at ABC told us.
That was my friend Bill Drentel, about whom we named the character.
Oh, yeah.
He worked for an ad agency in New York.
Yeah, that although we were maybe the 25th most popular show on television, among that 18 to 34 demographic, we were number 4 on television. So we had no idea before that. And that was why the network prized the show as much as it did, because that was the demographic they were going after.
And then I guess maybe it didn't happen this way, but at some point do you feel like, okay, now we're in a comfortable spot. Now the topics that the show was very small in some ways, but also very huge in the topics that you decided to put at the forefront. Was that did that come from a place of comfort at the network ultimately when you decide, oh, we're going to put two gay men in bed together, we're going to talk about the Gulf
But
War?
they couldn't be in bed together. One of them had to have his feet on the ground, right?
No, they couldn't kiss.
They couldn't.
No, they could be in bed together, but they couldn't kiss. That was the big fight.
Yeah, yeah. But what you're asking, here's the truth. What we wanted in the beginning was to tell stories about intimate life between people. And that meant keeping away the very big issues in life. So the idea that Nancy eventually had cancer, or we dealt with somebody dying, or two gay men in bed, that came later in the series, not because we were more comfortable, but because we felt we had laid the groundwork to talk about to do an episode about one person being jealous of another person and not admitting it, or how a married couple learns to talk to each other. That if you're going to try to talk about these things, which happen to every single person on earth, you have to keep out the giant dramas because they would drown out those little things we wanted to talk about.
And we had seen so much already on soap opera where they would address these big themes, but they were cliches, and we would say to ourselves, well, how do we do something that is about something that is true, but is not full of platitudes? And finally, I think where we came out is to say that what a cliche is a true thing that has had the authenticity drained out of it. And the key was to try to find that authenticity and ultimately earn your way up to things that were of greater import and greater consequence.
I'd love to ask the actors if there were any particular scripts that you got and you thought, oh wow, this is really my big moment here.
When I died, I just
Spoiler.
Yeah, right?
kind of, I don't know, had an impact.
I tell you what, it was a joy to read every one. You'd see when you see the crew, the craft service guy crying, sitting on an apple box in the corner, the scripts would just come one after another, and you'd see we'd get in there. Most TV shows, by the time you get through the end of the first season, half the cast doesn't read them and won't for the rest of the run. Because when you're directing them, you realize when they're asking questions, why would I say this? And you're like, because it's a story point. You have to say it. They don't read the script. We read them. Every script knocked me out. Couples knocked me out right away. The pilot was probably Therapy. When I read Therapy, and Michael J. Fox, who was a buddy of mine, called me after the episode aired and said, not only is it the best thing you've ever done, it's the best thing I've ever seen on TV. When one of those scripts, and it won Writers Guild, won the Directors Guild, nominated for an Emmy. I got nominated for Emmy. That was when Patty won an Emmy for it. It was just one of those scripts that had fairy dust on it. Page after page after page just ripped by, and you were saying, this is not like anything ever. And it was awarded as such. So I thought that script, but I gotta say, the funny scripts, I'd read a script and I might be in two scenes, but my scenes were funny. My IQ would go down a lot when the women would write my character. I remember that. What about, this is a really good, David came in when the show had that success and created an iconic character. That's almost impossible to cut into a group of 7 like he did and become one of the family. It's a really good question, I think, for David, because he was, so impactful.
Well, I did come in the middle of the second season, so you guys already had this great momentum going, and I remember I had done something with Ed and Marshall before. We had done a show called Special Bulletin.
That was amazing.
Which
It was a great show.
ATX Festival
Yeah.
they should do something about Special Bulletin. Did anybody here ever see that show? What was it, about 6 years before 30-something? Everybody's 83. young. There's
About a nuclear event.
Yeah, it was
One, yeah.
Tim's wife.
It was a very That was a very special
Yeah, that
show.
really-
I mean, it was one movie of the week,
Yeah.
but it was shot entirely in video.
Yeah.
And
As if it was a live news broadcast.
yeah. So we had done that.
Well, the truth is, I mean, we had this extraordinary experience on it because it started our careers, but in it, David was sort of the center of it, and he was extraordinary. So the idea that we would go reach out toward him was so present in our minds when we wanted to create this character. But we had no idea, because I have to say one thing, and I would love to hear you talk about this, because when you write a character, you imagine him a certain way, but he takes on a life of his own when someone appears, particularly when it's someone who you're not auditioning. It's an actor who you know and you know is going to bring something to it. And David brought something to it that was utterly unexpected.
In fact, I mean, we've never said this before, but since the person's dead now,
Yeah.
the character of Miles Drentel was basically based on Bruce Paltrow, who I had worked for very early in my career. I've never said this aloud before.
And Mike Ovitz.
Yeah, a combination of the two, both of whom had very fast rhythms, sort of ADD, kind of, let's do it like that, man, not like that. And that's how we wrote this character of Miles Drentel. And in walks Clennon, who gamely tried to do that in the first episode. But
You're being very kind.
But it's not who he is. And so one of the joys, actually, of doing a series over time is it is improvisational, and you look at, and by the way, in some way this is true of every one of our actors. Over time, you begin to see what the strengths of that actor is, and you write to that strength. But we realized that we had something in David that was gold, that wasn't how we first saw the character. So we just changed the character to fit him. And it just took off.
I have a story that really illustrates well his impact on
Can you hold that thought?
Do you have something you'd like to say first?
I am the boss.
You weren't the boss of me.
Please go.
Well, you're going to like this story. And it happened on the airport on the way here to this festival, actually. I got to the airport and went to the Starbucks line, or whatever it was. And Coffee Bean, tea leaf, thank you. And it was a line. There was a line. So I was going this way, and David was already at the counter. And we said, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" We started talking across the little line thing. And as we moved on, and David went to order his coffee, these two women were talking, and they said, "Well, ask him," pointing at me. And I turned around. They said, "Is that David Clennon?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And they said, "That's great, that's great. He was on that show 30-something, right?" And I said, "He was." And then as I kind of turned to start walking away again, and they said, excuse me, were you on that show too?"
Yes, but he died early.
Well,
he died young.
I said, "Yes, I was." And they said, "Which character did you play?" And I said, thinking, Gary. And they were like, And to try and help them along, I said, the guy who died. And they went, So you did an impact.
I only did about 20 episodes of the show, and this is a compliment to Ed and Marshall. They paid me for about 10 more episodes that I didn't do. And this is what was so smart, I think. I'm kind of clueless about the medium and how it works and everything, but I think you made decisions as you went along with this character to use him very sparingly.
Paying you to stay away.
Don't say anything yet, Ed. I'm complimenting you. So they realized, I think, that episodes that character did not appear in he was still a kind of presence. He was a threat that sort of hung over other people. And you did how many episodes altogether?
80.
80 or 90
Something like-
episodes,
what
and
you're
he only
getting to-
appeared in 20.
But what you're getting to is actually even more interesting, which is that now what a writer's room does is they get together and they plan an entire season, and they have the whiteboard and the cards and everything is thought through. We never had a writer's room. That was the two of us. We had some extraordinary writers with us, and they would come in one at a time, and we would work out the stories together. And it was chronological, maybe, but it was also based on what seemed to be working. And so it was curated, I think is the word I'd have to say. And it was hand to mouth. If a plot seemed to be working, then we could elaborate on it, as opposed to something having been overdetermined before the fact. And that's for instance, David, we got those extra episodes because we didn't know how many we would want, and we wanted to be sure that if we had something that was working, that we can then spin it out.
There's another piece of that that's really important, I think. We live in a world today of serialized storytelling on television. And we all love it, by the way. I love it. But there's a limitation to that. Good.
Go ahead.
You know. We've only been partners for 42 years. It's like, there's a limitation to that, which is that every episode becomes caught up in trying to move the story forward of all the characters. When we did 30-something, each episode existed unto itself as a meditation upon a theme. And, yes, something was going to happen in some overarching way across the season, but it didn't matter from episode to episode that we advanced that story. And it gave us the freedom so that, in the episode where the guys lost their business, which we called success, even though it was the opposite of success, everything in that story, the other pieces of the story could reflect upon what that meant, the shame, the sense of loss, the horror at feeling like a failure. Everything could concentrate on that theme instead of having to serve some greater thing. Well, this person has to have this happen because in the next episode, that's going to happen. So for us, it was a great luxury to be able to just tell a story about an idea.
And that was usually these days, that's the dictates of a network, saying you have to keep these characters vivid every week. And what it creates, to me, is a kind of Dickensian thing where the cliffhanger is the thing trying to make you gorge and then go on to the next to get that sticky thing that they want, for viewing. But to me, something is lost as well, which is something classic in a form of, conflict and denouement and catharsis, because you don't get it nearly as much or as easily, or if you do, it's done in a very sort of quick way, and this allowed us to do things that were deeper.
And I guess as actors, is it nice to have that so you're not having the conversation that is, so where's this going for my character? What's about to happen?
Kind of like life, that you don't really know what's going to happen to you next. And that they couldn't really tell us either because they didn't know, was kind of fun and exciting.
It was great.
Yeah.
I mean, it was great. One of my favorite things, we didn't go spend a lot of time in their offices. You'd go up and tell them a little bit about your life, and then it would end up being there. I told them my mom was an alcoholic, and Eileen Brennan shows up, and she's been an alcoholic. And I'm like, easy. And I should have known, because in their office, on the wall, was a cartoon. And there was a picture of a guy in his office desperately trying to write, and around the office are wadded up attempts at what he was trying to write, and wadded up with frustration, and the room's full. In and amongst all of the room full were like a dozen dogs. And the dogs are all looking at their master, watching intently as he tries to write. And in the door, and leaning against the door frame, is the befuddled wife, who's looking at her idiot husband and all the dogs, and his attempts to try to write something original. And the line is, "Why don't you write about dogs?" And you realize I should have known from that they would steal from all of our lives and their own lives. And that is so much what they did so bravely that each episode, it just sparked of that original. This was about a fight they'd had or about something they weren't handling well. And if they learned stuff from us, it made its way in. And anyway.
The gynecologist.
Oh yeah, that was Melanie.
Sissy's,
Might wanna elaborate
I
on
was I was in a movie with David, a movie called Missing that Sissy Spacek and Jack Lemmon starred in. And we went to the Cannes Film Festival with it. It won the Palme d'Or. And Sissy was in her 8th month of pregnancy with her daughter, Skylar Fisk, who's lived here and played music here. And they had to bring, she had a very old gynecologist in Beverly Hills, and he was too old to go. So they took the young, hot gynecologist from his Beverly Hills practice to go with her. So I was with Sissy and Jack the whole time, and the gynecologist who was with her. So we wound up having a really fantasy fling in the south of France. And I came back and I was telling everybody about it. And one day we're sitting at the table read of a new episode, and on the front page the title is "I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love with a wonderful gynecologist." And I looked at them in horror. But it was a great episode for Polly and I to play, where we both fall in love with a gynecologist.
They had to shoot through my legs like that.
Had to. I seem to remember you asking them.
Oh, yeah, I asked them. I begged.
Paulie has great
You know, you were
legs.
talking about the themes and shows. Like, one of the favorite episodes that they ever wrote for Melissa, and it was only on one time because ABC wouldn't allow it. It was an episode called Strangers, and there were 2 storylines in it. One was where the 2 guys were in bed together. It was a love affair between David Marshall Grant's character and Peter Frechette, his friend. And the other story was Melissa and her young boyfriend, Lee. And the theme was how we sabotage relationships. Like, that was what you were talking about. And that whole episode was about that, how we can get in the way. Because Melissa felt he was younger, and at that time, 30 years ago, that was maybe a bigger deal. And the show was only on once. And what was so amazing for me playing Melissa, they had written a fantasy sequence where in her mind, she has a fantasy. I had to play 3 characters, basically. Melissa in the office of a boxing ring, and everybody had parts in the fantasy, and it was black and white. And then there was Kid Stedman, which was young Melissa, against the judge, which was the all-knowing judgmental. So it was like a battle in her mind about should she or shouldn't she do this. And I remember I had to work with a stunt person and learn 2 sides of a boxing match, like choreographed, because I had to play both parts. We had that amazing Steadicam operator I was boxing to. It was this really ornate sequence, and everybody was in it. You were the judge, and Polly, you were my trainer, and it was a wonderful.
I don't think I was in it.
But it was.
Kept me out.
You weren't
Been dead at the time.
He was dead. But it was only on once because ABC got so much flack with the 2 guys in bed story that it only aired once.
Did you not want to talk about that? You're not remembering that part of the history fondly, the ABC portion of this.
No,
Whoa, boy.
no.
It's an amazing episode, and thank you so much for putting it on the air in the first place. Thank you so much.
You know, in the original script, which Richard Kramer wrote, the 2 guys were in bed together, and then they kiss. And we turned in the script to the network, and we got a call from the head of Standards and Practices in New York. And normally we dealt with one of their flunkies in Los Angeles. It was extremely rare. In fact, it had never happened before that the head of Standards and Practices would call us. There was this guy named Al Schneider. And, we both get on the phone, and he says, all right, I have some things to tell you, and this is not going to be a conversation. I'm just telling you what's going to be. He said, ABC is in support of two gay men being together. ABC is in support of two gay men being in bed together. ABC will never allow two gay men to kiss, period, over and out. And we sat there dumbfounded. And I got into this huge fight with him. Ed was laughing. Like, I just went after him. And it got really ugly. And at one point, I said to him, I can't believe as a Jew you're saying this to me. Because he knew we were Jewish. And he said, what does my being Jewish have to do with this? I said, who do you think Hitler went after in 1936 besides the Jews? The homosexuals. Oh my God, he went insane. He started screaming at me, how dare you? Like, oh, it was one of the worst phone calls in the world. But we were ready to, we were not going to take that kiss out. That was it. We were ready to do battle. And then what happened was David Marshall Grant, who was one of the actors, God bless him, I love him. He's so talented. He has a wonderful career. You know, he had some concerns himself. He was worried, his agents, you know, he came to Richard and he said, I'm a little worried about this. And Richard came to us and he said, you know, I've been thinking about this and I really believe that the most subversive and revolutionary thing about this episode is that two gay men are in bed and it's just absolutely normal and they're just talking about nothing. That's what's revolutionary, is that it's not a big deal. And I don't need the kiss. And so
it bespeaks something about same-sex marriage and its indebtedness to television. I think that, frankly, if you think about the number of relationships that were normalized, and I think that unlike a lot of other political issues, I think it dug in a very particular way to households that would otherwise not have even, thought about it or would have been, thought of its strangeness. But because it was in their living room, I think, and so consistently on different shows, I know we were among the first, but many people then started to do it. I think that really was a significant part, and because of the normalization you're describing.
Absolutely, and there wasn't the whole, on a very special episode of 30-something. Right? I mean, you never did that with any of the things you tackled. No. You did technically kill off two people on this panel.
Where's
Well,
one?
you killed Miles, didn't you?
no.
I thought you killed him
in,
off. You
in
didn't kill him.
Once and Again.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Killed him later.
Killed him
Right.
later.
Right.
Yeah.
They've killed off.
Very
a long
good,
way.
Bill.
Kept him alive. We kept him
He
alive in
knows
our
his
cellar
stuff.
for several years and then killed him.
Well, it's a funny thing because obviously we had talked to Peter about this and the cast, and it was a significant thing for all of us. Let me back up. There were so many things that were mirrors of what we were writing about. There were marriages and divorces and the birth of children and fights and things that were reflected. But there was also death. And we were determined from the very beginning that that would be a part of the show. But it had to find its way and the right way for it to happen. It's become a kind of trope now of television where, and something like Game of Thrones, in fact, depends on that anxiety about who's going to die when. But at the time, it was a very, radical notion that we would just take this beloved character.
But I think also, unlike Game of Thrones, where you get, the advantage of seeing them cut their head off or stab them, or when I first heard that I was going to die on the show in a car accident, I know everyone thinks it was a bike, right? How many people thought it was a bike? Yeah. Thank you. That. Come on up here. Come on up here. When I first heard it was going to be the irony of the death, I thought, oh, this will be fun. I get to do a big car crash scene, where the semi runs into me and I get to die my last gasp on the streets of the Schuylkill. But what they did, which is yeah, setting up a trope to a degree of people, leads getting killed off. But the way they did it was so interesting and so much more powerful, which was, instead of all that, all we got was a phone call. And that's how it happens. That's how, the living are the ones who experience the death, And when I saw that, my first reaction was, wait a minute, I don't get to do the car crash? But it ended up being so powerful, because that I relate to as someone still in the land of the living. And I think that's a different thing than what's become the trope now, Ed. I think it's much more graphic, the deaths, and they're much more melodramatic. And
This is more subversive and somehow.
Yeah, it really
Well,
was.
it's real, because usually when any of us hear if somebody died, it's a phone call. That's what's more real than being there, and nobody's really there.
Yeah, I was actually watching the episode last night, and it's just so remarkable because there's no speech about it, and there's no delivery of, it's just, he literally says, he's dead.
Right.
And then it happens again and again, because people don't actually perform a soliloquy when they're telling people they care about that someone they care deeply about has died. But it's just remarkable. It's like an incredibly quiet episode.
Well, Timmy, you talked about that moment, actually, that you're there with the phone call with Kenny. And in that same episode is also the episode, of course, and that was the intention, which is that the best thing happens and the worst thing happens, because that's the episode where Patty finds out that she's in remission, is going to be fine. And so he had to actually be in both aspects of it, because he's there with Kenny in terms of the phone call and with Patty in the scene.
And then Kenny asked me to watch him when he got the phone call. We became such the team sport of
He
our
was
show.
directing it. Ken was directing it.
Ken directed the episode and did just a great job. But he didn't want to be thinking like a director when he makes the call he gets a message to call the police, right? And isn't that what happened?
Yeah.
And he gets on the phone, and so he asked me to watch his performance. And he had just directed me. We were in the same part of a hospital set, 15 feet away. We're waiting for they end the half hour with Nancy's gonna be okay, and they start the next half hour with Gary's dead. It seemed like, if I remember it right. And that was one of our days at work. And it was for us, it was one of those days. It was a very difficult, there wasn't a lot of deep breathing on that day, and there wasn't a lot of laughing on that day. And normally on the show, it was a lot of laughing. Patty Wedding and I could never get through one take without giggling at each other when we would fight, because we loved each other and we were really good friends, and we would make each other laugh, especially when it was really good. But that day was tough. There was weight on the actors. When they say that they do it in a phone call, what they're doing is making us play it. And our reactions to the death are the audience's reactions, because they were living the show with us. We represented them. And I remember the moment of finding out that she's going to be okay after this long journey of leaving her and then getting her back. And then all of a sudden she got sick, and she was the most important thing to me. And I only wanted to do it one time, and we had to do it twice. And Kenny was really apologetic. It was very quiet on the set that day. There wasn't a lot of noise. Everybody knew what we were shooting, and it was very focused.
One of the hardest dilemmas we faced in the entire series was whether Patty Wedding's character would live or die as a result of the cancer. Remember, 30 years ago, the prognosis, especially for ovarian cancer, was not very good. And our initial thought was that she would die. And I have to say, we were so influenced that we got hundreds and hundreds of letters. Once we started doing the cancer story, so many people wrote in, and it became so important to them that she be a symbol of hope. And for us as filmmakers, this was a very confusing thing, because we did not see ourselves as in some way responding that way. We saw ourselves as, we have a vision, we're going to follow our vision. Sometimes life is very upsetting. But these letters kept pouring in, and we were going, should she live, should she die? You feel like this horrible, weird God, And then Ed comes up with the idea, and we could go on and on about where this comes from in our own lives, the way in which the best and the worst has come at the same time. But Ed comes up with the idea, okay, let her live, but somebody else dies. And it ended up being
It's actually based on probably a very famous French absurdist play that talks about Christ and Barabbas, because one of them gets crucified and the other one gets off.
Yeah.
And in an odd twist that I noticed last night, Patricia Heaton plays the oncologist,
Yes.
which I'd completely
Yeah.
forgotten about.
The only thing I want to add to the death of Gary at this moment is one of the bad things about doing it the way they devised was in that episode, all I got to really play was a dead body. And so I get to
But very well.
one of my finer moments. And I get to the set, and they put up all the dead makeup on, and suddenly I walk out and realize we're at a real morgue. And I'm going, ooh, interesting. Go in there, and there's a real drawer. They put me in a body bag in my makeup, zip it up, and shut the drawer. And I'm lying in there waiting for the action. You know, I wouldn't hear it if they said action, but for someone to open the freaking drawer. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, am I like experiencing my own death? This very existential moment inside this drawer in a real morgue as dead Gary. So thanks. Thank you.
Anytime.
Best work you ever did on the show.
And you mentioned that Ken directed the episode, but a lot of you ended up directing episodes of the show, which, correct me if I'm wrong, that wasn't very commonplace at the time.
No, look, Marshall and I were intent in our careers to be directors as much as writers from the very beginning, and we had trained as that, met in that context, and it was also something that was very, I think, important to us to create as much of a repertory company as it was to just do a television show. And it's not a surprise because Patty Wettig and Timmy and Polly had all come from the theater and from repertory companies, in fact. And there's something, that's a word that means a lot to someone who's been in it, and if you haven't, you don't quite know what it means, but it goes well beyond being an actor or being a director. I was raised with all the guys from Steppenwolf in Chicago, and if you look at the work that they've done and why, it's because they were, from the very beginning, sitting there in dailies, sitting there in table reads, they're talking about their lives, and that became something larger than itself. And part of that was to bring them even deeper into our process, and some of it's enlightened self-interest because they become much more complicit and compliant as actors when they realize the burdens on a director.
Just a cog in the wheel.
Yeah. But I also think when you look at all of their careers and the longevity of their careers after having done a television show, that's actually quite unique. And when I see Peter's show now coming out there after Kenny's show taking over ABC, and Polly's about to have a movie come out, and Melanie's about to have a movie come out, and Tim, I feel a little bit like the apostles have sort of gone forward and subversively found their way into the rest of the cultural landscape from that little repertory company.
That would make you Christ, by the way.
That would make you Christ.
Barabbas.
We used to call the directing process on 30-something, which was, that's one of the things about directing. You don't get an apprentice program generally. You just get thrown in. But this was an apprenticeship program. We got to actually learn how to direct. We used to call it the Herskovitz Zwick Samurai School of Directing. Because they, both being directors, they really, really made us step up and deliver. We'd go down. I remember the first time I directed on 30-something, he's cringing already. Ed took me down to the set, and I was like explaining to him, what I was gonna do, what I was gonna shoot, and he kept going, and as he walked away, someone was walking the other direction. He just said, he's not getting it. He's not getting it. And at first that's staggering. But what it made you do was go home and go, what am I not getting? What am I not learning? What am I not, it made you go home and do the extra work, the extra preparation. And that's sort of the way I've done it ever since. And I think that's true for all of us. There was this real value in directing on the show. It wasn't just for hire, like a weekly hire. It was.
I went to, there was, we talked about it last night. We got to hang last night, which was really fun. But I directed, first episode I directed where there were flashbacks of Ellen's character. It was a Polly episode. And I went to him and I said, I want to shoot these flashbacks handheld. And they went, I said, I want to shoot them at 30 frames. And they went, oh. I said, I want to shoot them in black and white. And they went, oh. They looked at each other and looked at me and said, it's your movie. And that never happens.
Yeah.
There's always somebody that wants to feel they made you the ability to make your own movie. We get it when we direct pilots. We get it when we direct movies or miniseries. But in network television, it's very rare. They're made you feel like you had an important job and they needed your A game. And I think it bled into all of our attitudes on writing, directing, the importance of filmmaking, how to make a good film. It all really came from these two guys. And our longevity, and Ken Olin, if he was here, would say the exact same thing. It really came from working under two masters, and they are masters.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. It's a great note to end it on. I want to thank you all for such a phenomenal show that means so much to so many people. It really changed the face of television. Thank you so much.